reason. Well, that is their claim. And I actually had some fun going through some old class notes, because there was a quote I wanted to find that was related to this topic. It was a quote by Stanley Fish. He's an American literary theorist, a legal scholar, author, and a public intellectual. And I was able to find this paper from one of my old classes, and it was called Faith Before Reason. And in it, Stanley makes this point. He says, "The difference between a believer and a non-believer is not that one reasons and the other doesn't, but that one reasons from a first premise the other denies." It's actually pretty profound, and we're going to be spending a few minutes on this thought, so look at it again. The difference between a believer and a non-believer is not that one reasons and the other doesn't, but that one reasons from a first premise that the other denies. Let's call that first premise a bias, a personal bias, or a starting point. And so that they both use reason, they just use the reason from two different starting points. So in this paper, there was another philosopher who asked the question, well, cannot reason be exercised before the first premise is in place? I mean, maybe we have biases, but we got to our biases via reasoning. And Stanley actually argues against that. He says, no. He said, reasoning doesn't create your bias, but rather it is the biases that you have that influence your reasoning. Another way of asking this is to say, can anyone reason without influence from their personal biases? And again, Stanley said no. And really the premise of his main idea here is that we are all products of our environment. We bring certain biases and worldviews into our interpretation of evidence or facts. And so our interpretations are not free from personal bias. Now, their point that the Christians start with the idea that the Bible is trustworthy is correct. I mean, we admit that. We start with that premise that God's Word is true. But what we need to make them aware of is that atheists also have their starting premises, their biases and belief systems, and that they may not be as open to evidence as they might think they are. To illustrate this point, I'd like to share a story about Richard Dawkins, one of the most outspoken atheists probably in the country today. He's got books out that attack Christianity and promote atheism, and it was in a debate that Richard Dawkins was asked, well, what would it take, evidence-wise, to convince him that there was no God? And he said the following, and I wish I was good at imitating his English accent, but I'll just read it with my own. He said, that is a very difficult and interesting question because, I used to think that if somehow, great big giant 900-foot high Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson suddenly strode in and said, I exist, here I am. But even that, I actually sometimes wonder whether that would. What's he saying? He says, even if Jesus came, 900-foot Jesus speaking in a large, booming voice, that would not be enough evidence to make him believe in a God. And the truth is if your mind is made up about what you believe and about what you don't believe, then no amount of evidence will convince you. Now, for those who saw the movie, the professor in the movie, his starting premise and where he came from was his mother's death, and he could not forgive God because of his mother's death. And it was that experience that colored his reasoning and his thought process, and that was the premise by which he approached the data. So atheists can say that reason is on their side, but in reality, everyone has starting ideas and values with which they look at the evidence, and that influences their reasoning. You will see what you want to see, and that is true for all people. And so as we begin to move from just taking a stand to saying something, when we begin to speak, one approach that we can take is to redefine the rules for engagement. Skeptics want to set the rules that they use the reason, and believers do not. And our goal in speaking is to show that we all start out with assumptions. We all start out with what I'm going to call statements of faith or statements of belief. And what is their starting point? Well, their starting point is that everything is explained without God. I mean, that's what science, you can't prove God through science, and so if we're going to try to explain things scientifically, by definition, you cannot bring God into believers. And the believer's starting point is, in fact, that we do start with God. And so really the question becomes, whose starting assumptions better explain the world that we live in? And that's how you should frame the question. Let's look at the world around us. And let's try to explain this world, first with your starting assumptions, second with my starting assumptions. Which starting assumptions make better sense? And you might be able in this discussion get them to admit that in fact they do have a starting statement of faith. They may not initially be willing to say that, but you can do this. You can ask them the question, well, how did life form on its own? And they may be able to come up with some quote from some scientist which is really woefully inadequate for explaining it, because in reality no scientist has even come close to explaining this. In fact, Richard Dawkins, this famous atheist, was asked that by Ben Stein in a movie, and I've shown this video before. We don't have time to look at it today, but Ben really held his hands to the fire, and he asked Richard Dawkins, well, how did life form? And Richard basically was honest. He says, I don't know. He says, nobody knows. And so Ben says, well, this is kind of, he didn't say this, but it implied this is kind of a key part of your theory and what you have to come up with. I mean, really, how did it happen? It had to have happened somehow. And Richard stammered and started a little bit, then finally basically said, well, maybe some aliens came and seeded life on this earth. This is the truth. Just Google Ben Stein interviews Richard Dawkins and you can see the video for yourself. Of course, he didn't ask the question where the aliens came from. So, if they're honest in this discussion, they're going to admit that they don't really know how life formed by itself. And so you can make some statement to the effect, well, even though you have no idea how it could happen, you have faith that it did, and they'll probably say yes. So basically that is their statement of faith. And how are they able to make this statement of faith where they put their trust? Well, basically they're saying, we're here today, right? We had to get here somehow, and because science is the rule and norm for everything, you can't bring God into the equation. Therefore, I'm going to try to explain everything without a God. And that is their attempt, even though it's woeful in its attempt to explain it. And so that would be their statement of faith. That is their starting point, and that would be their personal bias. And so I think Stanley Fish, a pretty profound statement. The difference between a believer and a non-believer is not that one reasons and the other doesn't, but that one reasons from a first premise or bias that the other denies. So when they pull the we've got a monopoly on reason claim to you, what we need to do then is to reframe the debate, to let them know that we both use reason. We just have different starting points, different starting assumptions. So a way that you might be able to do this is to say something like the following. And again, this is a conversation with a skeptic. Well, let's just for the sake of argument hypothesize that there could be such a thing as a God and that he created the world. I mean, just humor me. Let's just theoretically entertain the possibility that there is a God and that he created like he said he did in the Bible. this possibility will never be considered as even a possibility because of the way that you have framed the debate. Yet 90% of the world believes in a creative God. Now this 90% is high, but we're not talking not only just Christians.